Welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast. Episode 25 of Season 2. Your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion, where we will take it all very seriously, but not too seriously. What you've all been waiting for, someone to come and solve all of the problems in what is this dysfunctional government. Look no further, dear listener. You found it. A brief comment on the brouhaha, the pearl clutching that is the Kyler Murray film study clause in his new contract. Also, a brief comment on the new Instagram update and whether or not the universe is giving me a signal to delete the damn thing. To wrap it all up, episode 10 recap of Better Call Saul. Thank you all again for listening. Please like, subscribe, distribute, do the things. Social media better than I ever have.
Act 1. I solve all the problems with our government.
I don't like cable news and I don't like polls, and now I'm going to do a segment talking about cable news and polls. Somehow, out of the depths of the internet, I was made aware of a poll that was taken about the state of democracy and its future in the United States of America. And it was grim. It was very grim. Over 40% of those polled stating something to the effect of democracy will not be the prevailing form of government in this country in the next 50 years. That this country is headed towards a civil war. The most interesting element of the poll was that of those polled, the people that admitted to watching cable news, whether that be Fox News, MSNBC, or CNN, were almost twice as likely to state that the country was headed for a civil war and that democracy was no longer or would no longer be the prevailing form of government in this fine country. Now, those numbers look grim. The results look dire. And the fact of the matter is, it's all bullshit. Let's talk about that bullshit. Let's talk about how the country is nowhere near a civil war. Things aren't that dire. And if they were, there's a very easy solution to implement in order to fix all of government. Let's start with cable news and the polls. A bunch of people respond to a poll about the state of democracy, the likelihood of a civil war, where we are headed as a nation. I want to know how many of those polled admitted to watching cable news. As I have discussed with you in many a podcast segment, dear listener, cable news is a dinosaur. It is the dodo of the 21st century. It is going extinct. It is dying in front of our very eyes. Fox News can beat its chest that it's the number one cable news network, and all that's saying is we're the number one dessert at the retirement home, the tapioca pudding beating out the rice pudding. The tapioca pudding being the favorite may be true. That doesn't make the tapioca pudding great or even good. It just means it's the first out of the worst options. The best of those options is I elect not to eat any of those shitty desserts, just like I elect not to watch any of those shitty networks. You may be saying to yourself, as I am, dear listener, then who amongst those polled admitted to watching cable news, and how many of them were there? Because if cable news doesn't really have a following anymore, and those that do follow are most likely in a wheelchair or are in the marketplace for a catheter, dentures, or have a hip replacement surgery scheduled, we should know the scope of the people who are answering these polls. Look at the impact that watching cable news has, whether you are on the left, an MSNBC or CNN viewer, or on the right, a Fox News viewer. Look at the way this has an impact on how you see the country, how you see the future of the country. 2 out of 3, 3 out of 4 of these people believe the country is so divided that it's going to erupt in a civil war. a civil war as a testament to how little most people know. And we're talking about octogenarians. We're talking about people, many of whom hold themselves out as being better educated, having worked harder, and having a greater wisdom or understanding about this country and the way the world works. It's likely that this is the demographic that most likely believes there's going to be a civil war, and that is clearly a testament to watching that news programming that does nothing but incite conflict, separation, and ignorance. The question in and of itself is asinine. To simply ask a 78-year-old whether or not that 78-year-old believes there's going to be a civil war in this country in the future, that's a lazy question. There were parameters that you could actually point to. There were sides that could be taken in the first civil war in this country. There was a defining issue surrounding the secession of the states leading into such a civil war, that issue being slavery. What issue is on the horizon such that states are going to secede from the nation again, perhaps precipitating a second civil war? A bunch of social climbing fame whores on cable news networks or on Twitter does not a civil war make. And as I have said numerous times on this podcast, and as I will continue to maintain, to reinforce, the politicians that we routinely blame are people that we elect. These are our representatives. So to the extent that there's any dysfunction in the government, that's simply a reflection of the dysfunction in us. They have no room, no space, no opportunity to be dysfunctional outside of our empowering them to be dysfunctional. The brain rot that leads to our continuing to empower these types of dysfunctional people to go and engage in a dysfunctional process, and then to believe that there's going to be a civil war, that may be the most sane, linear thing that I think I've heard in popular culture, in the media, in cable news, in politics in quite a long time. It makes perfect sense to me that the person who would elect a politician that is basically lying to them and telling them exactly what they want to hear in order to engage in a power brokerage to benefit that politician personally instead of representing anyone, to buy into some separation, some tribalism, the taking of sides, and then to blame the other side such that the other side getting any measure of power is going to be a threat to the very existence of the nation, and therefore there needs to either be, a dictator in effect that takes over, or we're going to have a civil war. That to me is very linear. It's feeble, it's weak, it's simple-minded, it's shallow, and it's very linear. Okay then, smart guy, what's the solution to all of this? What's the simple solution to rectifying what is a rudderless ship, or a ship at least that has lost its course and needs to change course in order to find its way? It's simple. It's really simple, dear listener. It would take courage. It would take thought. It would take bold collective action. And yet, it would be so easy, so simple. I'll use myself as an example. I'm here in what was a red state, one that is turning purple, the state of Arizona. I have all of my history, all of my beliefs, all of the things that I hold dear when I go to the polling station. And I try to identify the candidate that I believe is going to exemplify these things. That is folly. Continuing to operate in that mindset is a mistake if we want to solve the problem that we are calling this dysfunctional government at present. So what should courageous, bold, informed Patrick do? Look at the ballot, identify the incumbent candidate, vote against that candidate, up and down the ticket. Don't care what party they are. Don't care what their views are. Look at the ballot, identify the incumbent, vote for the other person. 2 years later, identify the state of the government. If the state of the government is suffering from the same dysfunction, bold, courageous, informed Patrick presents at the ballot box, identifies on the ballot the incumbent, and votes for the other candidate. Up and down the ticket, irrespective of whether they're a Republican or a Democrat, irrespective of their views. A scant 2 years later, there's a bold, courageous, informed Patrick presenting to the ballot box. If the government is still in a state of dysfunction, mired in petty partisan squabbling, well, that voter Patrick, he identifies by way of the ballot in his hand who the incumbent is, and he votes for the other candidate. Yes, dear listener, whether or not they're a Republican, whether or not they're a Democrat. Let's do some math. Let's do some civics. What we've done here is we've identified an election cycle over the course of 6 years. That's every 2 years. Every 2 years you can go to the ballot box and you can identify a candidate running against an incumbent. Understanding the machinations of how our government actually operates. You've got members of the House of Representatives, you've got members of the Senate, and you've got a president of the United States of America. In 6 short years, dear listener, we can turn over every single member of the House of Representatives, of the Senate, and we can turn over the president. We, the people, have the power to literally clean house anytime we want. Think about how long it takes for governmental policies to actually go into effect. Think about how long it takes for the effects of those policies to be realized. It's often a decade, if not longer. We can clean out the entire government in 6 short years. Are you an incumbent candidate? Yes, I am. You're gone. And we, the people, keep turning the candidates over until we get some that realize we can't tell the people specifically and only what they want to hear in a 18-month election cycle, only to then go and serve the interests of some limited big money donors, corporate donors, foreign money donors. We may have the opportunity to serve those big money donors, but it will only be for a limited period of time because we're going to get thrown out. Now, the educated among you, dear listener, you will rightly point out the collective action problem, that it's very difficult to have someone individually go out and vote against what they think are their interests, particularly just voting against an incumbent candidate, if they can't be assured that everyone else is going to do the same thing. There's no point in going to a ballot box and simply voting for every candidate running against an incumbent if everyone else doesn't do the same thing. And that's a very valid point. The validity of such a point is rooted in a fallacy. And that fallacy is that you'd be throwing away your vote by simply voting for a candidate running against an incumbent. Why is that a fallacy? Because you're throwing your vote away right now. You're throwing your vote away by voting for the person who's telling you in specific limited circumstances exactly what you want to hear. You are throwing your vote away by voting for someone that goes on to Fox News or MSNBC to engage in some partisan politics, in some more accurately identity politics, using a magician's trick, look over here, not over there, pay attention to whatever I'm screaming about, not whatever I'm doing. You are already throwing your vote away. And I do have to make this comment because it's come through me several times. The irony of the baby boomers, this octogenarian generation now, being the generation of do as I say, not as I do. Maybe this is the ultimate last defiance to their parents, to the generation of sacrifice, so to speak. I'm not so old that my grandparents weren't instilling into me the old adage, judge a man by his actions, not his words. That is no longer the mantra today, and I would not blame it on the young millennials or any other generation of people, the prime mover from this turn from judge a man by his actions, not his words. It's the octogenarians. It's the baby boomers. They have got their partisan side, and that side can do no wrong. They have got their partisan side, and the other side can do no right. 6 short years, dear listener. 6 short years. Do we, as a people, have the courage to vote simply against an incumbent in order to clean house, in order to clean out the government? Can you, dear listener, as a Republican or a Democrat, look up and down the ballot without prejudice and identify the incumbent and vote against that person simply to start turning over the seats of power in government? How many people that are willing to actually go to the ballot box go with the mantra in their head, I would never vote for a Democrat. I would never vote for a Republican. How many people go to the ballot box stating, I will never vote for someone who's pro-life. I will never vote for someone who's pro-choice. I will never support any candidate who supports gun control. And I will never support any candidate who's one of those Second Amendment advocates. Whose fault is it? Whose fault is it that things exist the way they do? If we don't have the courage, the resolve, the wherewithal to simply turn over what we all understand to be a corrupt and dysfunctional government, then why do we deserve anything more than a corrupt and dysfunctional government? We don't have to rally in the streets with tear gas and Molotov cocktails trying to overthrow some oppressive totalitarian regime. We have the power to throw these people out of government anytime we want. We have the power to put them in their seat of government anytime that we want. We as a collective body don't have the courage to make these types of changes. And think about it from any perspective that you want, dear listener. It's simple. It's simple whether or not you believe in this type of action or not. 6 years is not that long a time. Simply going to the ballot box and voting against the incumbent, that's not a complicated voting strategy. Putting partisanship aside, putting economic, social, religious, community beliefs aside, going to the ballot box, simply voting against the incumbent. I don't know that it would even take 6 years. Once the American people demonstrated the resolve, it's very likely that within 4 years, once the politicians realized that they're just going to be thrown out unless they actually work to serve the will of the people instead of a limited number of special interests, you have yourself a high-functioning, responsive government. Do we enjoy it, dear listener? Do we enjoy having a dysfunctional government? Is it an excuse similar to a conspiracy theory that we can use to justify why perhaps we as individuals aren't reaching our highest potential, aren't realizing our dreams, aren't passionately moving forward in our lives? Does all of the dysfunction feed into a comfortable place of frustration and anger that we want to rest in? You couldn't find 3 swinging dicks on the entire eastern seaboard of the United States back in the 90s and early aughts that were throwing tantrums any more than I was about politics and the state of affairs in the country. Hell, it could be safely said that part of being an American is having a voice to express dissent with not only the government, but with popular culture or popular political movements. In reality, is that us being bold and courageous and informed? No. It's actually simple, it's easy, it's base, it's shallow. Being frustrated and angry isn't in and of itself a bad thing. It is a bad thing when you wallow in it with no ambition to make any changes or do any work to solve any of the problems that you allege you're frustrated by or that you're angry about. Are you upset about the state of the nation, octogenarians? Get out there to the ballot box and vote. And vote like a bold, courageous, informed person. Look at every single person that has been navigating those halls of power for the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years and vote them out. Do you want to create a better future for your children? Dear parents, dear listeners, go to the ballot box, identify every one of the incumbent candidates, and vote against them. Do you want to create a world of environmental harmony and perpetual EDM shows, dear millennials? Get out to the ballot box, identify the incumbent, and vote for the other candidate. The power to solve all of our problems is right there in our grasp.
Act 2. Pearl clutching over Kyler Murray's contract.
I haven't done a sports segment absent having a guest come on the show in a while. A local news story that dropped. It's actually a national story, but local to Arizona. Kyler Murray signs his new contract, and the sports world is in an uproar over a clause in the contract which mandates a number of hours that Kyler Murray must spend studying film. Otherwise, the contract can actually be voided. If Kyler Murray does not participate in independent film study for, I believe it's 4 hours a week, it's not something that's that arduous or onerous, the Arizona Cardinals can void his contract. And rather than mirror what's going on in the sports landscape, throwing a temper tantrum, this whole situation reminded me of the Michael Vick documentary on ESPN. I don't know if you've watched it, dear listener. It's well worth the watch. It's actually fascinating. Michael Vick, quarterback at Virginia Tech, the school had never reached such heights as it did under Michael Vick's stewardship. And he was, I believe, either the first or second pick in the NFL draft of the Atlanta Falcons. And the Atlanta Falcons immediately became not only a legitimate football team, but a contender to go into the playoffs, win, and maybe even go to a Super Bowl. And the Atlanta Falcons did enjoy some success. They did make the playoffs, although they never went to the Super Bowl. The team that Michael Vick was surrounded by before he was arrested on the dogfighting charges was actually a very good football team. So there was an opportunity for that team to go to the Super Bowl. Why do I bring all of this up? Vick, in the documentary, admits that when he was in Atlanta, when he was breaking records, when he was having Pro Bowl seasons, when he was leading the Atlanta Falcons to the division crown, leading them into the playoffs, winning playoff games, he didn't study. He was not doing independent film study, if film study at all. Vick admits in the documentary that one of his biggest regrets is not putting in that type of film study, particularly when he was young, particularly when he had such a good football team around him, and what could have been. What could that team have done if he had actually put in the time in film study and with all of his natural ability, been able to mold those two together to be not only such an athletic, mobile quarterback, but to be able to read the field, to read defenses, to anticipate a mental skill set that requires time, effort, culminating in that wisdom. I've seen all of this. Whether I've seen it on the field or I've seen it in film, I've seen all of this. That such a clause is in Kyler Murray's contract It really doesn't surprise me. I think this is a problem that young quarterbacks have when they come from college and they enjoy significant success. They may have certain habits in film study, and those habits may serve them well in college, but they don't serve them well in the pros. And that habit, or those habits, are I watch film with my quarterbacks coach. I watch film when we go to practice. That's a little bit of film before the actual practice. That may be a little bit of film after the practice. But I don't go home at night and at 8:48 p.m. pull out my laptop and watch film independently. I'm not coming into the facility early in the morning before I work out, before I actually have meetings and watch film. That such a clause appears in the contract tells me two things. One, this is something that the Arizona Cardinals have been asking of Kyler Murray for a long time, much longer than just this NFL season. And two, and probably more significantly, this is something that Kyler Murray has promised he would do in the past. This isn't the first time the issue's come up. This isn't the first time it's been discussed. And it isn't the first time that promises have been made. Kyler, you need to study film more. You need to do X. You need to do Y. I'm going to. Next day, is Kyler Murray the first person in the facility? No. The next day, is Kyler Murray the first person in the facility? No. And that promise goes unfulfilled. Kyler goes out on the field on that Sunday, does something amazing. The Cardinals win. All is somewhat forgotten. The second that there's a problem, there's a loss, or there's a situation in a game that clearly shows a lack of mental preparation, it comes back up. Kyler, you've got to get into the film room. You've got to study this film independently. Yeah, I know. I'm going to do it. I promise I'm going to do it. Well, the easiest way to have Kyler Murray keep that promise is to put the promise into the contract and say, if you don't fulfill this promise, we'll negate the contract. That Kyler Murray was willing to have such a clause placed in his contract, it shows to me that he probably understands I have to make this turn in my life. I have to make this change. I have to start watching film. I have to get better because this team is actually capable of winning a Super Bowl. They're making a commitment to me. They're making a commitment to the team, they being the ownership, the general manager. I have to get us across the finish line. And if getting us across the finish line means coming in at 6:30 in the morning, being one of the first people in the facility to watch film, so be it. In trying to be less of a judgmental prick, I look at something like this and I think to myself, what happens in 2 years when Arizona actually does win the Super Bowl? This will be one of those funny footnotes that is part of the resume of Kyler Murray that no one really pays attention to. Yet it may be the very thing, the very turning point that Kyler Murray needed in order to become a Super Bowl winning quarterback. How many times have we been held accountable for something, a change that we knew we needed to make, and all we can remember from that circumstance, that situation, is the shame, the humiliation, the lack of self-worth, the doubt. Sometimes we put ourselves in a position where we need to get that kick in the ass, and instead of looking at all of the negatives from that kick in the ass, we might as well just act as if, and move forward. There are a lot of folks on the Kyler Murray bandwagon, but there are a lot of folks that aren't, that still don't believe in him. And I believe this is the catalyst that he needs in order to prove all of the doubters wrong and win a Super Bowl as the quarterback of the Arizona Cardinals.
Act 3. The universe speaks, but do we listen? The Instagram update.
I did a segment very recently. I don't know which one of the episodes it appeared in because I'm not looking it up. I deleted Facebook. I got some kind of weird spam bug in the Facebook Messenger, and it just dawned on me. It came through me. This is the sign. This is the signal that you needed. Delete this thing. And I did. I do not understand the social medias. I am not going to spend so much time adapting to them versus them adapting to me. If the entire medium is being geared towards 14-year-olds, that makes sense. I actually understand that. Time, money, effort, satisfy your main audience. And now, as I understand it, Facebook actually isn't for 14-year-olds. Facebook is actually for Gen Xers, and all of these other mediums are competing with the 14-year-olds. Specific to let's all compete for the attention of the 14-year-old crowd. And I should be very clear about this. I keep saying 14-year-olds, but really it's people with a 14-year-old mindset and mentality. And that, unfortunately, encompasses a hell of a lot more of the population than simply people who are age 14. There are a lot of 40-year-olds out there who have the psychological, the emotional, the spiritual mentality of a 14-year-old. What has happened recently in the social medias in line with let's compete for the attention of the 14-year-olds? I don't understand the Instagram. I'm trying to use the medium in order simply to market this very podcast. That's why I'm on Instagram. I have an Instagram page that is a page for this podcast. I open up the Instagram and it's completely different. It's black. It doesn't scroll the same way. I can't really access things the same way. And the first thing that I thought is, what did I do? What button did I inadvertently push to change the entire landscape of this thing? Because now I can't not only navigate it, I have no interest in navigating it. I don't really have an interest in using it to promote this podcast, and I do it begrudgingly because I understand the power of the medium. I'm trying to be more passionately involved in social media simply to promote this podcast. Yet I get onto the actual platform, it looks different, and I'm thinking to myself, what the hell did you do, and how are you going to figure out how to get it back to quote-unquote normal? Turns out this complete and total clusterfuck of a change is not my fault. I didn't press any button. I didn't do anything. It's actually by design, by way of intent. Instagram changed the way its platform operates, changed the interface of the medium, evidently to compete with other social media apps, namely TikTok. I am not on TikTok. I do not want to join TikTok. As a moral, ethical, and intellectual stand, the TikTok is a Chinese spyware app. That's what it is. It's one of the most brilliant, sinister things that any foreign power has ever done in order to not only spy on a population of people in a country, to spy on the population of the world. A lot of bold-talking media personalities like to come out and quote 1984, George Orwell's 1984. Orwell didn't come up with something as mischievous and deviant yet brilliant as TikTok. We aren't going to have our freedom taken from us. We're going to give it away. We're going to give away all of our personal information. We're going to give away our freedom of individual thought, and we're going to do so for likes, for views. If I'm not going to join the TikTok, I certainly don't want to have to navigate a medium that's trying to copy TikTok in order to compete with it. Perhaps this is another sign. I don't know how the podcast is going to be marketed to the peoples. Perhaps this is a sign, though, that it's not going to blow up by way of Instagram or Twitter or, in fact, TikTok. Do I follow what I feel is a very clear and unambiguous signal from the universe? Delete all of the social medias? You don't need them? Am I that brave?
Act 4, Episode 10 Recap of Better Call Saul.
Episode 10 of Better Call Saul. Normally I reflect on the episode. I give it a day or two. There's so much nuance. There's so much intricacy. And these plot lines that have been playing out for the course of 6 seasons. Hell, going back to the Breaking Bad days, maybe the course of 10 seasons. Many of them are coming together, wrapping up. Episode 10 wrapped up a very simple plot line. The guy that approaches Saul in the mall as Gene, identifies him, won't let up, persists until Saul actually says, "Better call Saul," and then walks away. How is that plot line going to be resolved? How is Saul going to stay in his Gene character in Omaha without having to rely on Mr. Fix-It, the vacuum cleaner repairman, upending his life again, exposing himself to the potential to be caught again? No, he has to come up with a plan. And episode 10 was the culmination of that plan. Although it had all of the paces that one appreciates in the Better Call Saul universe, well thought out plan, the intricacy, the nuance that goes into the plan, how interpersonal relationships are so important to the execution of these plans, even with the twist of this guy slipping and falling in the mall as he's making out with all of the goods, I found it a bit tedious. I found it a bit boring. You know how in the Lord of the Rings movies, they really followed the pace of the books well, and it made for, although sometimes drawn out scenes, they all worked in service of the overall story. Then came The Hobbit, and really they didn't have enough content to make 3 full movies. So they drew it out. Every battle scene, they had to go on for an extra 5-10 minutes. Every scene of exposition had to have a few extra lines added, had to be drawn out a little bit more in service of a 1 hour and 50 minute, 2 hour and 10 minute movie. All of the battles, all of the exposition, a number of the storylines, they worked more in service as filler than they did serving the overall story. I don't know that the ultimate resolution of the guy that approached Saul as his Gene character and knew who he was, could compromise his fake identity. Was that storyline worthy of an entire episode of what is the final few episodes of the entire series? I think not. I will say that it was somewhat refreshing to see the entire episode in black and white. I thought it did work in service of being in that cold, snowy environment and seeing this Gene character being nostalgic, looking at all of the nostalgia that was the Saul Goodman character, the ring, the clothes. I particularly liked the scene when Saul, Jimmy, whatever you want to call him. I don't want to call him Gene because that's the fakest of all the characters. When Saul is going through the mall after the robbery has taken place, and he's savoring that moment, that he was able to pull it off again. And he picks up what is a despicable, ugly-ass shirt and pairs it with nothing more than an atrocious tie. And there's that moment where it looks as if he's tempted to go and buy it. It so fits that Saul Goodman character, he is tempted to go and buy it. With the guarantee of mutually assured destruction and the wrapping up of that plot line, where do we go from here? I've actually received some input, as rare as it is, given the number of listeners that I have, about the final 3 episodes of Better Call Saul. To be clear, when I got the input, it was the final 4 episodes, but I'm really looking at this episode as almost a throwaway. Yes, it did resolve a plot line. Yes, I think they could have done that in 20 minutes instead of 45, 48, however many minutes it is. As disappointed as I am in this episode, I would be equally disappointed if, as one of my listeners opined, Kim is just gone. There is no more plot line for Kim. It would seem a disappointment. It would also seem almost too light too easy for the way Vince Gilligan has written the episodes of Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad. It just feels like there's more to the Kim story than we've been given, and perhaps that's me as a fan holding out hope. Certainly, I would imagine that in the last episode, if not the last two episodes, we're going to see the resolution of the Saul Goodman character, whether or not that is his leaving Omaha, his being caught or killed, the sliver of that pie being perhaps he just lives out his life as this Gene character in perpetuity. Perhaps as the Gene character in Omaha, Saul puts his effort, his intelligence, and his remaining money behind finding Kim. My excitement has not abated, though it has been somewhat dampened. I'm going to believe that this is the thoroughbred reaching the halfway point on that mile track, pacing itself, and it's going to gallop the rest of the way to a strong finish. This is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast.